All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our last session of the day. And it is going to be another roundtable. We've got, again, fascinating experts from around the world, around the globe, to discuss a topic which is quite close to my heart, but also to my thinking as well. And an area that we definitely see is going to have a lot of movement in the coming years. The topic is integrating the gig economy as future talent recipe. And we know that in the past, the organizations had a tendency of developing core competencies within the organization. But as we move along and step into the future, which is the VUCA world, which is the digital world, which is the experience economy, we may not be able to develop all sorts of skills required for strategic initiatives in-house, and especially operational excellence as the way we have defined them in the past is also radically going to be changed over the coming years. So that is going to be the topic, very, very interesting topic. And we have got our panelists here. So I'll start with Anne-Cécile Graber, who is joining us from somewhere in Europe with a sketchy connection. Then we have, and I'm leaving the introduction to them. They were just prompted. She's right now in Berlin. Then we have Dean Smith, who is also from somewhere in Europe, I think somewhere in Spain. And then we have Christina Jackson, also somewhere in Europe, originally from the US. That would be Netherlands. And then Ravi Loganathan, who stays somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, sometimes in Singapore, sometimes in Chennai, and the rest of the time pre-COVID on planes. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome each one of you. So, Anne-Cécile, we'll start with your introduction.
Hello, everyone. I hope the connection stays good for the conversation. I'm French and I live in Germany. So Stuttgart, for those who may know, not that far from Munich. I'm a consultant in organization and change management, and I've been starting to be into the gig economy a year ago, just before Corona made our life very different. And beforehand, I worked with big companies such as Volkswagen as a change consultant, but also startups and medium-sized companies. So that's where I come from.
Let's go to Spain.
Hi there, Dean Smith. Live in Spain, but from the UK, and spent quite a few years in Asia. I'm an interim manager for various activities, commercial and operations. And over the years, I've managed some global and national customer service centres, front, middle and back office operations, and global BPO relationships. I think the gig economy is going to be an increasing need as we move forward. I think there are some challenges with that, but the signs are very positive, and actually COVID perversely has helped that situation because technology and culture has evolved rapidly in the last 12 months to enable this type of thinking. But for me, the challenges are the things to address proactively to get it right and avoid any impact on the business and the customer.
Thank you, Dean. Ravi.
Hi, I'm Ravi Loganathan from Singapore. I came from India back in 25 years back, joining Seagate to begin with, and then moved to Allied Signal, Honeywell, Standard Chartered Bank, and right now I work for Danaher in PAL Corporation, Microelectronics in implementing SPC. And right now we are working from home, looking forward to start our work from office in June. And really excited to go to office after a long time. Thank you.
Very good. We'll talk about that office bit in just a while, but let's do the, complete the introduction. Christina.
Hello, I actually hold two passports. I have a Venezuelan passport and an American passport. So I'm kind of diversity in one person. I have worked, however, my whole life in Europe. I currently work for Covestro. I've also had my complete professional life in the chemical industry, and also for a very long time been working in operational excellence. I'm currently pursuing my master black belt, and I'm a certified black belt.
Cool, excellent. So thanks for joining us today. And in fact, we've actually got a very interesting mix of panelists here. So my bottom half of the screen are people who are on the other side of the gig economy. So essentially interim or consultants, external consultants. And the top half are people who are in organizations, large organizations, who dabble in the gig economy, but you're on, let's say, the buyer side of things, right? So, but let's start with Dean. Your perspective on gig economy and why is it getting so important in this operational excellence space?
So let me start with an example. I think it's good to illustrate. For many years, things like consultancy for operational excellence and so on has been a gig operation anyway, and I've done many projects on that basis. But the challenge has always been really for the workforce, the core workforce for front, middle and back office operations. And that's the area that I think still presents an interesting challenge, albeit it's becoming easier to envision now and to progress with some confidence based on what I've seen happen over the last few years and particularly the last 12 months. So the challenge for me is really about taking the technology and the common sense of what we've learned in normal shared service, BPO outsourcing partnerships, and translating that into the new world of an extended gig economy. Now, it's not going to be for everybody. A gig economy implies that you have various part-time people that are maybe not full-time employed or utilised, which can mean a degradation of knowledge and service behaviours and so on. So the challenges behind that whole list we'll go on to later, but I think there is a huge potential opportunity for this particular space to evolve to enable peaks. Now, in my last role, we tried to develop that gig concept with our BPO partner. And so we had a redundancy of about 5% as if for peak operations, unknown peaks, but we expanded that to 15% over a few months because we needed to have extra capacity for unknown challenges that were becoming more frequent because of certain network or core system issues. So there are ways of doing it within the framework that you already have, and we used a trusted partner for that. But even that turned out to not be enough. So for me, there is an avenue for businesses to start offering gig opportunities for both BPO and retained services.
Thank you. Ravi, you've worked largely with large corporates in your life, and large corporates do have the bandwidth of experimenting and engaging experts from outside, and yet there is a strong, let's say, a strong objective of managing and maintaining core expertise within the organization. So what's your perspective on the topic?
Yeah, if you look at my engagement in Honeywell, when I joined in 2003 as business services head for Asia Pacific, is mainly on transformation of the business processes, consolidation of the shared services organization like IT, HR, finance, from individual entities to moving to the center of excellence in Bangalore and Shanghai. That's the first stage of global consolidation of business services. They generally, any company, they call it as GBS, Global Business Services. So that's the first phase of transformation in moving the processes from the individual entities to the center of excellence. And that's where they engage the operational excellence resources, especially as a master black belt. So I went in there to take it's almost like an internal consultant role. Even though, the role what I played actually can be played by external consultant, but the reason for having people like me as a master black belt internally to take the leadership role is to tackle the change management. Because one of the challenge in Honeywell is, when the consultants may come and go, and we don't have a good kind of a process in place to what you call take the lesson learned from the consultant and then rolling out, or even the transfer of knowledge to the resources. So Honeywell strongly believe that that can be done only when the person is working internal to the organization. So I was fortunate enough to take that role as an internal consultant to work with the business leaders to carry on the transformation in moving the processes to the center of excellence. So that's the first phase. And then later on, I moved to supply chain organization of aerospace, where we have 14 manufacturing sites. It's more shifted from Six Sigma to Lean, where the focus is on improving the operational efficiency improvement. There again, we develop our own black belts, our own lean experts. As a matter of fact, I certified more than around 75 black belts and 25 lean experts within the organization. So that may be from, people from quality or from materials organization or even from manufacturing operations. But it is not a full-time black belt model. It is embedded resources within the organization, where as an individual I will drive and I will work with the business leaders. They will take it as a project leadership role as a black belt or lean expert. So in a way, the knowledge is transferred from the operational excellence to the respective business leaders, so that we can strengthen their hands with the skill set and tools, so that they can do their own improvement in their areas. So that's the model we have in Honeywell. That's what I experienced. But maybe I can talk about my experience in Stanchart Bank and Danagar in the next session.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Ravi, for the introduction. Christina, you've also been part of larger organizations as well. What is the change in the landscape that you're witnessing with regards to gig economy?
Well, what I see is from a point of view of being able to be flexible with your production, the gig economy can be very, very helpful. So, for example, we have models where we look at how much production we make, and then depending on that, we'll keep a certain group of people which stay core to our organization. But we have other roles which we know, or some tasks that we know we could actually move out into the gig economy. So if production needs to increase, then we would want to be able to hire these people in to be able to help us to create that extra production. And that's where I see the biggest use of the gig economy in the production environment. Now, in the operational excellence environment, I actually see it being very useful for hard problems where you maybe need some external expertise. So we are currently working with data scientists. We don't have them in-house. We work with them externally. They have an expertise which we don't really need in-house. We only have the occasional problem where that's necessary. And, we've also had other types of problems where you really need that extra help, especially in the beginning of a journey for your training needs. I think that it's very useful to make use of the gig economy.
That's a great example, Christina. Thanks for sharing that, the data part, right? Antisil, a question for you, right? I mean, you're on the sort of provider side of gig economy. Quite often, the tendency of organizations is when it comes to strategic work, when it comes to some of the more contextual work, they would try and keep it amongst themselves. And when it comes to more transactional work, more mundane work that nobody else wants to do, they want to give it to outside. And I'm not necessarily talking about shared services and outsourcing, but even some of the other parts, write communication, draft communication emails, or do something on change management. What's been your experience on that part?
Well, it's really interesting to see that the conversation I've had with organizations, mostly in Germany, are changing because before they wanted to have someone just to do the work that was, like just a bit of work. And right now, when I look at Germany more specifically, there is this demographic change that is happening. And so there are less and less young people to take over the jobs. And they have no other choice than go to younger people and to find people outside of Germany. And so the gig economy is pushed by the demographic change in Germany and in the old Europe, I would say. And so the experience I have is that the conversation is changing. And we are not seen anymore as, oh, we just take you when we need you. It's more like, let's be partners for a long time and make sure that when the needs are here, as Christina said it, that they have already the people here ready to act. And there is this need of flexibility, the desire to be able to have the work-life balance that we have as a dream, and to make it possible. So we have on one side organizations that need talents, and on the other side talents who want the flexibility. And the gig economy is really the good match, let's say.
Very good, very good. Dean, you've been in the interim management space, and I've spent some time in the interim management, right? Quite often the problem that we see is we're parachuted at a very short notice, and then often we're asked to do the impossible, right? And the first thing we get in is get a download of what's happened, and then it's like, why the hell? So excuse my, language here, but why didn't the organization engage me earlier? Because we could have done so much better rather than literally a last-minute band-aid. How do you go about navigating those, and why do you think you are in a better position than somebody internal to an organization?
Yeah, well, ideally you need both. And just to Ravi's point earlier, it's always good to have people within the organisation that are charged with that sort of continuous oversight and improvement, operational excellence piece. But occasionally, strategically or operational design, things can go wrong. Things can happen in the business that cause those challenges. So the unexpected can always cause a problem. And maybe the experience or the approach of the work, the team that's in place at the moment may not fit to respond appropriately in those circumstances. But the first thing I always do in an environment, no matter what the role, is to get the data. And the one thing I find that's generally lacking in most organisations I've worked with, and I'll say lacking, some are quite good, but often can be massively improved, is the reporting, the metrics. So the measurement, reporting and insights part tends to be the thing that if you can improve that as a stage one focal point, the rest, because it's visible and because you're then identifying the trends and issues more precisely, you can get people more engaged and you can identify the hotspots and you can work on the things that are causing the real pain points. So often these issues arise because people aren't measuring the problem or the challenges or the opportunities in the right way. So typically that's why they call you in as a last minute, because it's suddenly become above on the radar, whereas it's always been there. They're just not actually looking for it in the right way. So typically when you fix the reporting, the measurement side, you do get a huge step improvement, because then everybody can see what the challenge is and you can focus people on targets. And then it's really just about attitude and systemizing process and using the automation in the right way and so on. There's a whole bunch of tools that you can pull together to make things work. There's no one right way. It's about looking at the particulars of that circumstance and designing the right approach for that in a very systematic approach. I do find as well there can be sort of panic set in, and often that comes, people get operationally immersed within an organisation because you're full-time employed in that role. You're looking at that role in the context of what you've got to focus on and your objectives and your particular role attributes. And sometimes it's difficult to take the blinkers off for the people employed in those positions. So, I've been in employed positions in these roles, but I've still used consultants because it's great to just get somebody to come in and rock the boat and shake you up and find a different perspective and look for the things that you've become numb to because you're so used to it. So I see gig workers for both interim and management roles or specialist roles to be still quite prevalent. But using, as Christina was saying, using gig workers also for the workforce side, in particular for unknown operational planning issues, planning for that and having a framework where you can dip into extra resources when it's needed, and then growing your retained or BPO or whatever partner resource framework that you have, based on the success and the learning that you find from temporary leverage of gig workers. I think there's a whole opportunity in that space for both specialist or senior roles, but also for hands-on operational roles as well.
Thanks, Dean, for that. Now, my question is going to be for Ravi. And Ravi, by the way, I think there's a bit of an echo that comes from your mic. So, maybe when you're done, if you could just mute your mic.
Oh, okay.
No,
Sure.
but now the question is going to be for you. So don't mute yourself right now. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So what we see is another thing, and sort of continuing the theme of interims and short-term surge resources, right? So when it comes to operations, we see a lot more interim managers being brought in, interim senior managers being brought in. It's not necessarily the same for operational excellence. Why is that? I mean, any perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at even one example, maybe I can tell you right now. We are going through the online space SPC implementation. When we start this SPC implementation program, I started the training manually in generating the control charts using Minitab, and then you have to collect the data, and then manually you need to do the data analysis and then explain to the operators and shop floor managers to do that, and then we have internal Paul paperless team. Why not we develop our own software to automate the creation of SPC charts? We try to generate some programs and all, but then when we look at it outside, there is a company called Camline who provide a very good software called Space. Then we engage Camline, and then we evaluate the product, and we engage them as a consultant. They came in, they set up the software, and they conducted the training. And if you look at all our manufacturing line one by one, we do have the Camline people to come and conduct this training. But what happened is there is a dependency created, and if you don't have Camline person on the side, we may not have a continuous support, and sometimes the operators or the supervisors, they don't know what to do with the program, and then we decided to hire someone with that knowledge from outside. So to have a continuous engagement with manufacturing associates. And not only that, we plan to roll out to multiple manufacturing units. So we thought we need to have some replication and standardization of this rollout to multiple locations, where we can't be always depend on the external consultant to do this job. So we created we hired some internal talent ourselves, and then now she's taking all the things under her shoulder, and then she's able to train people, and there is a continuity, and she created her own training material, and the engagement, we still have engagement with Camline, but it is streamlined much better, and we managed the change management issues with people, with our internal resources, where the management is very comfortable to work with compared to external consultants. That's our experience in Danaher.
Cool. Thanks, Ravi. So at this point in time, I'd also ask the audience if you guys have any question or reflection, please put them in the chat or also put them in the questions box. We'll ask our audience, sort of our expert panelists, to react on that. Christina, so you guys mentioned about the need for certain services. When you engage people, let's say in your case for data, in Ravi's case for that technology, and Cecil mentioned about some change management stuff, right? Is it more services? Is it more tangible? That's when you engage, or is it something else where you would go out and engage people that you cannot solve internally for an expertise?
Well, I think we engage external people for I guess you could say maybe 3 different types of work. So we engage external people for this high knowledge work. So that's where I'm referring to data scientists, or maybe even a consultant. You might call in a consultant for their expert knowledge. Then we have a second group of external people, which might be interim managers, as Dean mentioned a little bit earlier. That'll come up and shake you up a little bit, I guess. Right. So, what Dean mentioned, we had a little bit of issues with one of our supply chain organizations, and we brought in an interim manager. He came in and he really created a bit of stability within the organization. And then later, he left, and you bring in a permanent person again. And I think the third situation where we use the gig economy is then really for, I don't want to call it mindless tasks because that's maybe derogative, but for maybe the simpler or to learn tasks. So, for example, we have several reactors, and one of those reactors is easier to handle than the other reactors. So when we need to produce more material, we'll hire people in to work on that reactor. And our operators that are then maybe normally might be working on that reactor, we move them to the harder reactors. So we make sure that our workforce can work on all of our reactors, and that our workforce, knows how to do everything that they need to do on the work floor. But we have this one reactor is easier, and that's where we might bring in our temporary workers to work in that sort of work. And we'll do the same sort of exercise in other departments. So in quality, we'll outsource the easy tests. So yeah, in our case, I think I see 3 different areas. So the highly specialized, the interim manager for shaking things up, and the quote unquote easy work that you can teach quickly.
Sure. So staying on the examples that you gave, right? And I have a kind of a follow-up question here. Because especially the last one where you talked about, managing or doing stuff at a plant. Is that a warm ecosystem, meaning is it the same set of people who are being brought in as and when required, or is it absolutely cold? It's like anybody who's got the skill, we invite you in. I mean, what is the normal process there? Would you engage a company that's you've got a relation for the last 5 years, and as and when you need, you bring them in, or how does that work?
Well, no, normally you would contact a company that specializes in recruiting this type of employee, but it's not the same employee. So for that last type of work, you really do get different people every time, and they'll come in and they'll work for 3 months or so, and then they'll go back. I think it's similar to the seasonal work that might happen in an Amazon, or that's also happening a lot in just in agriculture, where things have a normal seasonality. And then, you need to bring in extra people. So the organization that you work with will probably be the same, but the people that you work with will not.
Right. Okay. Anzazil, I saw you shaking your head, or nodding your head, not shaking your head. So any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, the idea of the seasonal worker, I think it's moving for some kind of jobs where you need people at some specific time in the year, or even in the life of the organization. And so that's why I was like, yes, that's exactly what I'm living. I come always in the same situations for different organizations that are coming at the same stage. We need someone to help us think about our situation differently, to be more creative and innovative. And then they think about me. That's the seasonality of my job. And so I can only agree with what Christina said.
Yeah, I think also in the specialist area, I should probably include like these really cool workshops. You have this one consultant you work with, and you bring them in just for these sorts of maybe vision creation, or so that would be one more area I think that I should add.
Yeah, no, they're good. Sorry, Aravind. One thing that Christina sparked a thought, because we used our BPO partner to try and get the gig concept going, because we wanted to have longevity in the supply, but also to get repeat gig workers, because clearly the problem is with workforce, people are actually doing the front, middle, back office stuff for us, and this was a telco operation, so there is some complexity in understanding the processes, the technology, the policies, and so on. So we wanted to have some continuity in the resupply of gig opportunity. So we did a couple of things there. First of all, we went on a campaign of multi-skilling in some particular areas, both within the retained team but also within the BPO. And that enabled us some supply flexibility for peak unknown challenges to move people across teams very quickly. So we had an immediate response capability, which would allow us some flexibility and would deal with a significant portion of the peak demands that we saw, particularly for call center items. But the other part of that is that then we were in the BPO, we were then multi-skilling some of the standby agents. Now, for mostly front office, but also some back office areas. And those standby agents could come in from other clients, if that capacity permitted, within the ecosystem of that BPO. And we found that actually very helpful. And obviously that then meant that you had to train more people across a wider client base in the BPO, because obviously if one client's also suffering particular issues at one time, then you can't rely on that one set of resources. So we had a plan where we multi-skilled and trained up a bunch of people outside of our core supply that were working other BPO operations for the clients in the same supplier. And then we could draw on them when we needed for certain activities. And that also helped tremendously. But the multi-skilling piece, and I take Christina's point, generally for pure gig workers, you would tend to focus on using them for the simpler to learn activities. But this, and we did definitely start in that area, but this enabled us, with having this multi-skilling longer term strategy, it enabled us to generate a wider range of talent within the same supply chain for the skills that we needed to be available on in any of those demand areas as and when demand increased. So we found a solution that worked pretty well in a sort of gig basis within a single supplier. But even then we had some challenges, because we put in a system that was just, it didn't work well. And so we had a sudden demand that we didn't plan for. It wasn't expected to be so poor in implementation. So that doesn't work all the time, and then we had to just recruit like hell and onboard like hell, and you got all the problems then with rapid scaling that you get in any operation if you don't do it well, and I can share all of those as we go throughout this session.
Right. No, thanks for bringing that perspective. Continuing on that, as there's a famous quote which says, "Nobody ever got fired for hiring McKinsey." And Christina, you talked about shaking a tray. And what we find is at a senior level, junior level, simple to learn. It's more kind of, the gig economy is involved probably more. But at a strategic level, it is much easier for organizations to engage another organization versus people who are extremely skilled in those sort of jobs, interim managers or interim directors. What's your take? Should organizations do more of those? Because, big companies also come with a big fat check, compared to some of these individuals who can still equally adapt in doing that work. What's your perspective? And this is your personal opinion. We're not going to hold you for what you say as your company's.
So let me try, because I don't know if I completely understood the question. So what you're asking is maybe what is the value add of these big consultancy companies?
No, I'm saying, when do you do consulting companies versus individuals, and especially at a senior level? Because junior level, I think it's quite clear, but at a senior level, how do you balance that judgment call?
Well, I think it sometimes depends whether you need to have benchmarking information or not. I think that the power of a McKinsey or a Boston or any of these big consultancy firms is that they have a lot of underlying knowledge that that's basically what they're selling, right? It's what they have learned by working at so many different companies, and that is their knowledge. While when you're working with an individual, then it's very specific, right? You either want, like the case that Dean explained, an interim manager to come in and really show people how to work with KPIs, create a certain tranquility in the organization where they learn to prioritize what is really going wrong and what is maybe looking worse than it is. I think that's what an interim manager brings you, and what Mackenzie brings you is all the knowledge from having worked at different organizations, which a person just can't have. So I've also been an independent consultant, and I bring my experience, but I can't bring you the experience of, a whole bunch of different companies because that database I don't have. So I think that's the main difference between the two. So it's really about your objective. Do you need to benchmark and understand what's happening, or do you or do you just need a skill that you want to use?
The reason I'm smiling is because Ravi, you don't even need to raise your hand. The moment you unmute your mic, we know that you want to say something.
Great. Yeah, I just want to add one comment to what Krishna has just now mentioned. In Standard Chartered Bank, especially in financial crime risk mitigation program, we don't have much internal expertise to run the organization. So we engage Deloitte consultants as our consultant. Not only our consultant for setting up processes within financial crime compliance, but also as a compliance auditor. So they have two roles. So when they join as a consultant, we don't want to treat them as a consultant and employee. So we hired them as a temporary employee to own the whole end-to-end process, and we do have internal posting with their title, like a transactional monitoring head or name screening head, things like that, so that they can conduct the weekly or monthly reviews and going through end-to-end implementation of all the process controls, so that we can take a complete advantage of their process knowledge transferred to organization. So it is a slightly extended embedded, extension of the short-term consultancy to long-term engagement or medium-term engagement, so that we will have a reasonable process transfer take place within the organization. I just want to add this example to what Krishna has mentioned. Thank you.
Can I just chip in as well? I've been a consultant for quite a few years and worked an employed consultant when I've been in interim and operational leadership roles. And I find the big difference, as Christina says, they're great for the bigger companies, are great for that benchmarking and getting the overall rubber stamp on things. But I do find they're quite limited in the main. And I know there are exceptions, but in the main, they're quite limited in the dynamic that you can get from those relationships. And actually, I find working with specialists or individuals who have been around a bit, a little bit more interesting and a bit more value added, because you can work more dynamically. Big organisations, big consultancies have huge overheads as well, so their costs are just stupid compared to the individual sort of hiring that you can do. But their practices can slow you down as well, because they have to get everything rubber stamped and second guessed, checked, quality. It just drives me crazy sometimes working with big consultancies, because the pace is artificially slow. And that's sort of really, as a consultant myself, always been working in small companies or independently, I find that really frustrating to have to work with the big guys who can't work in the dynamic that I would want them to work with when I'm hiring them to do a job. And so don't get me wrong, I've worked with some really great consultancies, but they tend to be the smaller ones, the ones that have got that customer dynamic as a front of mind sort of working practice, rather than the bigger, slow-moving oil tanker type of businesses where they have to go through certain rigors to deliver something. Those I don't find add the value that their price tag demands.
Yeah, and I wanted to actually agree with you there, Dean, that what I see as well is that sometimes they'll deliver what is really a very young professional. And of course that, and that young professional,
Right. Yeah.
that young professional, he comes with all this great information in the background that he can lean on and take a look at and use, but he is learning, or she is learning.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
sometimes it's like, come on, just...
And you look at the rate that you're paying for them to be trained in your environment, it drives me crazy. It really does. And, especially when you get the big team approach, and usually with the big companies, it's always you've got the senior partner, you've got the unit director, then you've got a team of consultants and junior consultants. Honestly, it's a money-making machine. I get it. And you're right, Alivan, companies say you won't get fired for hiring ABC, but it's not value for money in many cases. I mean, some cases they do. If you've got a full commitment and they're given full ownership of a particular area, they can make magic happen. But that's rarely the case in these sort of situations. And I find, exactly as Christina has suggested, I would use them for some benchmarking and for some workshops maybe. But, with day-to-day operational fixes and things like that, I find them, it's just too costly for the benefit that you get. And the pace of change is not what I would want in the operations that I lead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of concur with what you guys just said. And by the way, I guess when Dean, you mentioned about oil tanker, you're not talking about chemical companies in Netherlands. So just to be sure. But coming back to the topic, I think you've
we just
hit
had
the
one
nail.
stuck in the channel.
Well, yeah, exactly. So staying on that topic, and I'm kind of going to reflect on Caroline, who was from Philips, who was there in the last session, and one of the things she talked about was future talent recipe, right? Future talent formulation, or the portfolio of skills, and what is increasingly becoming clear, that in the future, or in the immediate future, we are going to have a much more VUCA world, and this is something Devyani mentioned in the morning, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? So VUCA world. Second thing is that, fortunately or unfortunately, operational excellence directors, senior managers tend to be expensive. If I had to hire somebody like Ravi, I'll have to spend like a couple of lifetime of salary in order to hire him in our company. I'm just joking, Ravi. But there also, because of the current pandemic and otherwise, there are lots of good, experienced people like us, talent in the market that's come available, which are at a much more competitive, but also purely from a cost to the company kind of a scenario. They tend to be a lot more cost effective. They have got the right experience. They've got the battle scars. They've earned the medals, and they're ready to sort of go. Also, because they don't come with any political baggage, because when they come in, they are independent interim people, right? And then the last but not least is the skills decay. We see rapid skills decay that's taking place. What was valid 20 years back is not valid, or may not be valid in the coming years. So what should be the consideration for senior managers, executive leaders, directors, in terms of future of their organization, future of operational excellence, in terms of gig economy, which is centered around more the strategic thinking, more the strategic build-up, and the middle management, rather than simpler to learn lower end of the value chain. So, Anne Cecile, since you are nodding your head again, you get to go first.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if I reframe it or rephrase it, it's the question about how do we, as organizations, should we go with the VUCA world, knowing that the gig economy could be support. And I think it's the capability of learning and learning again and learning again. And if we look at people who are okay to go into the gig economy, to live this risky life, if I talk for myself, I love learning. So it's not something I'm going to stop. And people that I know who are also in the gig economy and are consultants also have this curiosity to learn and to develop themselves. And so they have this intrinsic motivation to learn, which is a big plus for any organization because they don't have to pay for the training. We do it ourselves. And so that's what I would say from the perspective of the young consultant that I am.
That's a very good perspective, Ansel. And in fact, I'll also reflect on what Dean and Christine had mentioned about, engaging some of these large consulting companies. I think, and having worked with almost all the big names during my GE days, I can tell you that there are certain advantages definitely what they bring in. They bring in a lot of, I call it knowledge repository, right? So they have done tons of projects across the globe, but what they bring to the table, where I still see some sort of gig economy still struggling there, is a way of telling the story. They've got the right frameworks. They'll use font size 4 in order to put on a PowerPoint page, and they'll completely show the world on a page, right? I think that's their strength. Where they lack, and Dean, you highlighted that, majority of the people who get engaged are from the junior levels, and the senior partners are there essentially for mentoring or for whatever. But it's usually the junior level. What I used to find missing quite often is that brainstorming, that bouncing of ideas, that partnering on critical strategic thinking. Unless it's a senior partner where we could have that conversation, but usually at a more junior level, that was missing. And I think that's where the advantage of gig economy can change the rule of the game. Dean, what's your
I agree with you. I think mostly it's about the way that people think, and you can get good consultants or bad consultants. It's just about how their mind works and how they engage with you. So if you happen to find a really good consultant, whether it's from a big consultancy or a small independent one, you're still going to get a benefit because that particular individual is going to deliver the value. They're very customer-centric, they're flexible, they're thinking in a dynamic way, they're exploring ideas rather than pro forma practices. And that's something I found a little bit disappointing in many of the larger businesses. They tend to have a way that they've done it before, and this is the way you should be doing it now. Instead of going in and looking what the problem is and what the opportunity is and piecing together the right approach for that particular circumstance, which is usually a better outcome, in my opinion. But I totally agree with you. You can get access to all of that world of knowledge in a big company. And you were asking the question earlier about whether, how to incorporate it at the senior level. And for me, in any practice, it's always good to have a checkpoint from an external. We all get operationally immersed. When I've been leading these things, you do get stuck into the detail. You get pulled into it. You can't help it. It's human. So it's always really good to have somebody come along and point out things that you could consider doing differently. And I've always done that. Even when I've been in employed roles or on a long interim assignment, I've always used externals to come in from time to time to checkpoint what we're doing. And obviously there's a bandwidth issue. If there's a lot going on, you need that help. In my last role, I had so much going on. I had a couple of people on long-term sick. I had no choice. I had to hire multiple resources on a temporary basis to come and fix the problems that weren't being managed because the people just couldn't cope. So I think there's all sorts of reasons as to how to use those resources at a senior level or a specialist level, and that will persist forever. I can't see that changing.
Right. The next question is going to be around sort of generational divide, right? Some of us who are in our early 20s are a lot more agile than some of the other people who think Lean, Six Sigma, even go back to BPRs and the Toyota Production System, GPS, and all that stuff. Good stuff, right? How do we sort of engage with this millennials and Gen Zs? In order to sort of be part of this journey and keep them motivated? Should that be part of the ecosystem of gig economy, or should that be something that organizations should look into developing in-house? And the reason for that, I ask, is and industry reports say that millennials and Gen Z have less number of years on an average with companies. The company loyalty is based on experience rather than the length or tenure of their jobs, right? So, just a quick reflection from any of you or a couple of you on how to sort of engage millennials and Gen Z through gig economy or through developing them internally.
I love the question. It's really interesting because there is always this divide between generations and genders, and so and I think the most important is to communicate with one another and understand what those younger generations may be willing to do and what they expect from an employer. It can be as a gig, in the gig economy, or as an employee. And I think the values of the younger generation have changed over time. And so being able to understand this change of values without having negative perspective or prejudice against them, and again, doing the same work with the younger generation so that they can work with people who have learned other things and have other values, and bridging maybe on common values. I think that would be the most important, coming together with a common language, and trying to see each other as human beings at different stage of evolution. I think that's the most important, having open conversation with everyone and discussing.
Right. So let me build on that. You talked about values. Let me call it knowledge repository, or part of it as knowledge repository, right? Because one of the challenges that when you engage with external resources, right, is contextual knowledge. Especially if you bring them in for strategic, thinking, or in interim position. It's the contextual and the judgmental thinking. Judgmental, I understand, is probably never going to be outsourced or given outside of the company. But a lot of the contextual knowledge is as much knowing or having institutional knowledge or knowledge about the own organization as much as it is best practices of what happens in the outside world, right? So given that, how should the organizations in the future be preparing to codify some of this contextual knowledge so they are in a better position to engage millennials and Gen Z from a knowledge repository perspective?
I don't know. I think that generation actually is more about delivering. They're almost still very idealistic. So I feel it's a generation that you actually need to help them see how they are helping. So I don't know. I think that they also need to learn, of course. They're in a learning stage, and that's part of what we need to do is develop them and help them grow. But I think the other thing that's maybe different from their generation to mine, I think mine was just happy to have a job, and their generation, I mean, they really want to know what they're doing, what they're contributing, how they're helping, And I think that's also a lesson for all of us to try to help them to see how their work is meaningful. And at the same time, build them up.
Yeah, helping them to see their competencies, yeah. Dean, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you. I would add to that in that totally agree, but I think the same argument for anybody that you work with in any capacity. It doesn't matter generationally who they are. It's they're a person, and everybody has similar baseline needs as a person, and particularly in their careers and how to enjoy those careers. So although I think you're absolutely right, the general culture within a generation is going to be different generation by generation. The core values, the core needs, oh, nice cat. The core value and core needs of everybody is quite similar. And I find that, as Christina says, if you engage with people, no matter who they are, the communication protocols might be different, the style of engagement might be different, the examples that you use might be different. But if you resonate at that core human level, it doesn't matter what age you are, it's still going to resonate. And for me, that's the most important thing, is just remember everybody as humans, we all have certain common needs, I think, as human beings, to be valued, to be respected, to be listened to primarily. And I find, actually, in organizations I've worked with, the simple act of listening to your team members is the number one improvement that you can make when you go along. Listen to what they have to say, listen to their experiences. And you've got all ages and all types of generations in the mix usually, so there's different perspectives of individual views. But for me, it doesn't matter so much about generations. It's about treating everybody as humans and respecting their particular.
That's a very good point, Dean. See the common language, what you just now mentioned. I just want to extend. We were in the Six Sigma days. They call it as a common language across the organization. So in the same way, the collaboration also is very important, especially when you drive big data or using technology. integration of technology with OpEx. I mean, for example, they have a very good knowledge on developing software or developing or even creating workflow and all. But when you come to capability building, process capabilities, or even making the process, with zero defects before you automate things like that, that's where culturally they need to get sync with what we are trying to do it in terms of improving end-to-end process and integration of technology with the big data platform. So I think the that's where people like us we can add value with our experience and skill set, where we can educate or we can even fill up that gap when they don't have their skill set. But at the same time, the moving forward the Industry 4.0 framework, I think eventually the operation excellence OpEx model will merge with Industry 4.0. So it is going to be a one entity in the next 5 to 10 years time. Yeah.
Well, I must say, what
Excellent.
I find harder to teach to that generation is maybe the same thing that was hard for all of us, which is the soft skills. It's showing them how to stakeholder manage. It's showing them, and that's really what I've found. They are so key. I mean, Industry 4.0 and them is almost one, right? I mean, my generation is the last of the Mohicans. We were brought up without cell phones, but we got them early enough that we're comfortable with them. But this generation has never lived without it. They've always had a phone in their hand. They've always been able to look anything up. And that means that they're very comfortable with technology and they're very comfortable with managing data and stuff. But what you still have to help them learn the most, I think, is the soft skills, the stakeholder analysis, the how do you communicate, the how do you say things in a nice way, I guess.
It's
and even more now.
Sorry, go on.
I think it's even more important to work on the soft skills because the technical skills can be learned with YouTube and everything is learnable, like with internet. But the human side of work and it's always been the hardest part for everyone. But the human side is really where we need support and to understand how to be user-centered, client-centered, the other one centered, like not me centered, but I'm serving someone. What does he need? What does she need? What can I do? What are my competencies and how can I support this person, his or her development?
Yeah, and just on the soft skills, I totally agree. It's the one area that you tend to learn by experience, but I think it's also important, apart from clearly mentoring and coaching your team in things that you've learned and things that work or don't in various critical organizations. It's important to give them the freedom to make their own mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. And, that's the thing that I've learned so much from over the years because, boy, I've made a lot of mistakes. But it's great to have gone through it and learned from that. And so it really sticks when you think about those moments that you've learned from. And I think it's important for anybody, particularly, as you say, the technical sort of born generations who are less exposed to, I suppose, the humanity of contact and engagement with stakeholders, to let them go through that and to experience it. And they will learn a hell of a lot in that process. It's probably the number one thing that adds value, I think. It changes attitudes, it changes performance, it changes everything when they learn from their mistakes.
Cool. Just a couple of compare and contrast, and then we'll kind of come to the end of the show. So, funnily enough, the number of YouTube training that's available on technical skills versus the number of trainings available for behavioral skills is 1:100. So for every technical skill, there are 100 behavioral skills training that are available on YouTube. The irony is that people still don't end up learning those necessarily, right? But before we leave, let's hear kind of your final thoughts on integrating the gig economy as future talent recipe. So, Ravi, let's start with you. Your final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we grew up as operation excellence in a very traditional way, and it's, I think, time for us to learn to, I mean, to really work with the younger generation, especially the one what we just now talked about it. One key example I can say is the standard work. When we talk about the standard work where we apply in the typical lean manufacturing operations is very much applicable in the gig economy, especially when we do industry 4.0. Before you do any automation or any machine learning or artificial intelligence, we need to have the baseline standard work in place. So I think these are all some of the things we can play a good role in terms of perfecting the process, but at the same time we can learn from the younger generation in terms of integrating the platform and listening to them in even um, co-creating the content for the gig economy. I think that's where it's going to lead to all of us.
Thanks, Ravi. And Cecil.
After the conversation we just had and the exchanges, I think the most important is to remember that we are learning what the gig economy means, and so to be open to the conversation. And I would really emphasize on talking with people instead of about people, creating those conversations that we have, for example, to reflect on what it means. And I think we will be surprised. Like if we meet in 10 years, it will be so different from what we think now. And so I'm quite curious to see the development that we will see.
I'll still be in my 20s even after 10 years. That I know for sure. Christina.
Well, I must say I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been lovely to hear all of you. I think from my perspective, the gig economy is really something that will help us go through the VUCA, to help us deal with this volatile environment that we're in. And I think maybe something we haven't reflected on as much is that we have to make sure that we always do that ethically, and that we'll always make sure that everyone that we involve, we are involving in a way that also benefits them. Which is something that I sometimes have seen not go so well, not in my industry, but, we've just heard about Uber and how they had to fight for their rights. So I think that's also something that we should always keep in the back of our mind, make sure that we use the gig economy to everyone's benefit, to the person in the gig economy and also to us in the industry.
Thanks for that. The oil tanker economy. Yeah, absolutely. Dean, finally to you.
Okay, so 3 points really. First of all, I think in an operational role, in a leadership role, use all the brains you can get to sort out your problems or to create the opportunity. It's quite rare to have everything that you need in one place, and it's always good to have a second pair of eyes or some external knowledge come in and prompt change or new directions. Secondly, in thinking about the need of the gig economy, it's usually about demand and supply. And when your demand is higher and you need to supply more resources for whatever level of skill, there's always an opportunity to leverage more from what you currently have. So start there rather than think about jumping to gig workers. We got an extra 10% flexibility from our existing team members just by taking a different training and planning approach, for example. So you can create a lot of flexibility from within already. So before jumping to gig working, then think about what to leverage in your existing frameworks already, whether that's retained or outsourced teams. And third, when you do need to set up gig working, whether it be for specialist roles or senior leadership roles or for hands-on workforce, make sure it's done in the right way that's right for, as Christina says, you and for them. There's a lot of challenges right now with things like employment rights. You've got to get the right engagement, you've got to get the right skills and how to continue that training with the right people so that they're effective and giving you the right quality, sort of NPS scores and so on that you need from those people. And also the right sort of security and technology frameworks, because all of the above goes horribly wrong if you haven't considered security and particularly information security in today's remote workforce. So, but I think, that sounds very bleak. I think there's a huge opportunity here, and I'm seeing companies now providing platforms that are technically secure with the right sort of frameworks behind them for you to dive into and set up a pure gig opportunity that's not actually BPO. And so I think it's going to change the way that the economy works around the supply of gig workers increasingly moving forward. And for where I operate, I intend to keep using them where I can.
Yeah, a very nice way of summarizing it. And in fact, I completely agree with whatever all four of you mentioned on the topic. The fact which is given, apart from that, I'll be in my 20s, even in 10 years, is that it is going to be VUCA economy, and therefore it is going to be that there will be a lot more gig economy coming into play than we have ever seen in the past, right? It will be pragmatic, prudent to plan for it. And I like the way, Dean, you mentioned about 10% extra is where you can start engaging some of them. You can start looking at some specific ecosystem that you create of leadership, where you can bring in some people with very specific senior level skills for strategic thinking, strategic discussions, and that we probably will see a lot more happening in the coming future. But also specialist skills, which is digital data or whatever, that even uncertainty, dealing with uncertainty, that kind of skill, situation leadership or conflict management and those kind of things, right? So it looks like we are going to see a lot more of that, right? Given that, great pointers, great insights that you guys shared. I think we will probably bring in some of the pieces, especially around skills, around leadership, in our subsequent events. So later on this year, as well as going into next year, because these are some of the problems that organizations face, which they're facing day in and day out. And I think there's a lot of merit that they can derive from these conferences. So the video of this particular roundtable is going to be available. So please share it with your team members or with your colleagues if you feel that you have spoken sense on this panel, and if you've learned something during this panel. And with that, I would like to thank all of you being a great panelist. It was as entertaining as it was intellectual and informative. So thank you for that. With that, I would like to raise my hands and give you a round of applause, virtual sort of shaking of hands for being part of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so what are you doing?